Hello everybody. At this time we are talking about the law of demand. The law of demand is one of the most fundamental concepts in economics. Alongside the law of supply, it explains how market economies allocate resources and determine the prices of goods and services. The law of demand states that the quantity purchased varies inversely with price. In other words, the higher the price, the lower the quantity demanded. This occurs because of diminishing marginal utility. That is, consumers use the first units of an economic good they purchase to serve their most urgent needs first. Then they use each additional unit of the good to serve successively lower valued ends. And then we move to graphical representations of the law of demand. The law of demand is usually represented as a graph. The graphical representation of the law of demand is a curve that establishes the relationships between the quantity demanded and the price of a good. The shape of the demand curve can vary among different types of goods. Most frequently, the demand curve shows a concave shape. However, in many economics textbooks, you can also see the demand curve as a straight line. The demand curve is drawn against the quantity demanded on the x-axis and the price on the y-axis. The definition of the law of demand indicates that the demand curve is downward sloping. It is important to distinguish the difference between the demand and the quantity demanded. The quantity demanded is the number of goods that the consumers are willing to buy at a given price point. On the other hand, the demand represents all the available relationships between the goods prices and the quantity demanded. And then what factors affect the law of demand? The law of demand states that as the price of a good or service increases, the quantity demanded decreases, and vice versa. Several factors influence the law of demand. The first about price of the good. A higher price typically reduces demand, while a lower price increases demand. And then the second, expectations. Anticipated future price changes or economic conditions can influence current demand decisions. Third, about income of consumers. Higher incomes generally increase demand for normal goods, while decreasing incomes may reduce demand. And then fourth, consumer preferences. Shifts in consumer preferences or trends can impact demand independently of price changes. And fifth, price of related goods. Changes in the prices of substitutes or complements affect demand. Lower prices of substitutes or higher prices of complements can increase demand. And then we move to assumptions of law of demand. The law of demand states that all other things being equal, The quantity demanded of a good and services is inversely related to its price, and this is one of the most foundational principles in economics based on few key assumptions. The first assumption is consumer preferences for lower prices. When the price of certain commodity is low, consumers tend to buy more, and when a cheaper alternative is available, they would always go for it. And then the second, availability of substitutes. It assumes that most products have good substitutes. If a product has few or no substitutes, people may still buy the product in case the price rises. And then third, stable consumer preferences. This assumes that tastes and incomes do not change over time. This means that usually changes in demand are due to a change in price and not because of changes in taste and income. And then fourth, perfect information. It is also assumed that consumers have full information regarding the availability of commodities and the prices prevailing so that their choices are better informed. And then how do the law of demand relate to the law of supply? The law of demand and the law of supply are closely related economic principles that work together to determine the price and quantity of goods and services in a market. The law of demand states that as the price of a good or service increases, the quantity demanded of that good or service will decrease. Ceteris paribus, or all other things being equal. The law of supply states that as the price of a good or service increases, the quantity supplied of that good or service will also increase. Ceteris paribus. Both laws coexist and complement each other in determining the market price and quantity of a good or service. The law of demand describes how consumers behave in response to changes in price, while the law of supply describes how producers behave in response to changes in price. The law of demand and supply interact to establish the market price and quantity of a good or service. The point at which the quantity demanded equals to the quantity supplied is called the equilibrium price and quantity. The market at this point is said to be in equilibrium and there is no excess supply or excess demand. The equilibrium price and quantity are determined by the intersection of the supply and demand curves. Any changes in the market, such as changes in consumer preferences, production costs, or government policies, will shift the supply and demand curves and cause the equilibrium price and quantity to change. In summary, the law of demand and the law of supply are closely related economic principles that work together to determine the price and quantity of goods and services in a market. The interaction between the law of demand and the law of supply leads to the establishment of the equilibrium price and quantity, which is the point at which the market is in balance and there is no excess supply or excess demand. I think it is enough. Thanks for watching.